Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to be participating as a moderator in a conversation with Narina Rustamji. It's a book I had wanted to read for some time, and this gave me an opportunity to read the book and also to have some prior conversations with Narina, which we are continuing in a public forum here. So Narina, please, let's begin with, what got you interested in this topic and writing the book?
Yes, so great love stories have multiple origins. And I think that I will just start with two possible origins. The first is when I was an undergraduate, I was interested in religious heresy. And I would pore over hadith, the translated volumes of them of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, reading through all the different rules and religious injunctions. And I started making a catalog of numbers. If you do a certain action, 70 times more chance of getting to heaven. If you do another action, 7 times of chance of going to hell. So I started calculating all of these, collecting these in my mind. At that time, I would spend my summers with my grandparents in Quetta in Pakistan. And my grandfather, who was a very learned man, would watch me reading through my Xeroxed copies as I would go through these numbers and think about what it meant. And he said to me one time, books. All you do is read books. Everything you need to learn is in a garden. Here's a garden image from Quetta, Pakistan. It's early April, May. Quetta is known for its roses. This picture is actually taken from this Wednesday. So I wanted to share it with you as part of the motivation. And I think for those of you who love gardens, and for those of you who know the Quetta soil, and there are some in the audience who do, you know how the soil absorbs the water, how parched it is, how it reaches its fullness, and how plants and vegetables thrive as a result. So I look at this image and I realize the bottom part is not as clear. You have the kind of the gorgeous colors of the flowers. You have the green, the lushness, the respite of the eye and looking at it. But when you look at the bottom, you also see that cracked earth. And I think that's what has always drawn me, is that relationship between the culmination of something and kind of the earthly need to fill that.
Great. So let's talk about, begin talking about your book. And so the book is it's a highly informative book. And I think there are many remarkable aspects to this book. And I'll just highlight a few of them. One of them is the trajectory or the way Narina has plotted the chapters. And she begins from kind of early accounts of heaven and hell, which is in the Quran and in the Hadith and Seerah literature, okay? And then the sort of these accounts move forward into the 11th and 12th centuries, and then further on into the 15th and 16th centuries until the present. And in some ways, you have there's a way in which the story of heaven and hell is being both, in a sense, narrativized with more drama and more detail as the centuries progress. And also it begins to proliferate in different mediums, right? So there is, and it begins to find expression in architecture, in carpets, in the garden, and various other forms. So it's a way of thinking about these tropes, of heaven and hell, and how kind of productive they've been, right? How generative they've been for Islamic culture, kind of transnationally and transhistorically. So it's a highly informative book. I learned a lot from it. Let's begin with the early account. So how would you say? So Narina, would you summarize how would you kind of summarize the way the Quran deals with heaven and hell? Right? If you just had nothing else except the Quran, what picture would you get of heaven and hell?
Right? It's a good picture.
Ah, okay.
Yes. I think as a historian, one of the things that drives me is I like to look for things that are invisible, things that are suffused through text, material culture, images that other people do not see, but are right there in your face. And I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about the Quranic verses is I would challenge you to go to any page in the Quran, flip through it, and you will find some verse that deals on that page with either heaven or hell. And so it really forms what I would call a kind of polemic in the Quran, and that is an orientation about the possibility of life, the consequences of the Last Judgment, but also how being on a certain path allows you to enjoy the glories of the garden. So in the Quran, heaven is called al-Jannah, or mainly is called al-Jannah. There are other terms as well, and that translates as the garden. And I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects, is that as a garden, it conflates both this cosmic perfection, which we think of perhaps as a spiritual state, but also an actual garden. And it has such a material dimension to it in the way that that garden is described, and in terms of its sumptuary goods, what makes up that garden. And so for that reason, it is a very interesting way that you get both the material and the spiritual at the same time.
So already in the Quran, you have a kind of an imagery of both heaven and hell, which are quite vivid, and are quite are characterized by their kind of sensory, character, and also by them, in a sense, their attention to their kind of materiality, if you will, right? If you have both heaven and hell already described in specific ways in the Quran, what is the relation between heaven and hell? In other words, is this a duality? Is this a binary? Do you find that also in the specific tropes that the Quran uses?
That's a very good question. They are definitely linked. I think it would be easy to call it a binary, although the tropes do not always carry over every single time. I would say that there is much more description of the garden than there is in the fire, but when you see description of the garden, the fire is usually within the context of the verse very similar. In terms of the reward of both places, it's interesting that the garden is about social companionship through time and space, so the ability to meet both your ancestors and your progeny, whereas the fire is isolated, it's lonely, it is a place of self-punishment. So you see that kind of duality that'll show up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that duality is there all the time.
And there's also in Al-Jannah, there is a sense also, at least in some verses, of a sense of stasis and peace, right? That one in a sense is immersed in an environment and in a kind of a sensory world, and a sensory material idealized world that is one of in which there is a certain degree of lack of drama or lack of narrative when one is already there, right?
Yes, but there are so many sumptuary goods. So that I think that even though it has a static image to it, does not mean that the imagination cannot appreciate the silks and the brocades and the carpets and the silver vessels that show up there.
So next we move to the hadith and the seerah literature. So the hadith are the recorded sayings or episodes related to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And the seerah literature is a narrative account of the Prophet's life. Now, it's important to remember that both the hadith and the seerah literature was not collected in writing until a couple of centuries later, right? So, of course, in hadith, kind of scholarship, there has been, even in Bukhari and Muslim and the 6 canonical collections, the hadith scholars are very conscious about kind of also ranking hadith according to their standards of authenticity. But when you come to hadith literature, you find a more elaborate hadith and seerah literature. You find more elaborate and more narrativized ways of thinking of where heaven and hell are described.
Yes, and so it's from those, what I like this term by Kevin Reinhart, swift glimpses of the Quran. you see in the hadith, questions that are being asked about the afterworld and elaborate descriptions of what the goods are, what are the silks, what are the different types of brocade, how do I understand what the nature of faith is, what is the believer's bodily composition. And what comes out of that image is a kind of sublimated or let's say transformed world that is everything that the earthly world has, but rid of temptation, rid of taint, rid of negative emotions like jealousy. So it is this kind of cosmic perfection that is promised for both the believer as well as the actual landscape. And I think that's why one of the points that I make in the book very early on, because when people think about traditions of heaven, we are very much limited by Christian frameworks of that term. And I make this point that in the Islamic traditions, you do not just have an afterlife, but you have an afterworld. And you need to understand the garden and fire really as places that are populated by beings, that are populated by objects, that are populated by these transformed material realities. And that's why it's so resplendent.
Let's move further.
Let's go.
To the 11th and 12th centuries.
We're going to take you all the way to the 21st century.
Yeah. So something remarkable happens in the 11th and 12th centuries, right? And is that you have a number of commentators who are writing, manuals and texts that further dramatize and narrativize, the experience of heaven and hell. And this is very nicely discussed in chapter 6. And there are a number of names, including people whom I didn't know, like people like Ibn Habib, but also people like Al-Ghazali, right, who are kind of key philosophers in the Islamic tradition. Al-Maqdisi, Ibn al-Jawzi, and many of them are in a sense building up, I would say, on the accounts of the Sirah. But there is, but what's really different with these commentaries and these texts in comparison with the Hadith and Sirah literature? In other words, how have we moved? How have the accounts, transformed?
They are narratives, and I think that's what's so interesting is that you start to see by the 12th century a formalization of the vocabulary of the goods, that the sumptuary goods that are described, but also the narrative framework. So there you start to see a framework that I know all of you know, the journey to the different levels of hell, 7. The journeys to the different levels of heaven, 7. Each one of the gates guarded by a different prophet. Each one of the levels symbolized by a different jewel, populated by different saffron and musk and myrrh and all the types of products that, as a historian, you look at those products and start saying, when is this coming into the Islamic world? So let me give you an example. The Quran uses the term yaqut, or gem. Often, interpreters of the Quran, Yusuf Ali, for example, translates that as ruby. Well, the term actually, yaqut, is not ruby, it's a gem. And so when you start seeing sapphires, or a very easy one, when you start seeing lapis, for example, you know exactly what the trade route is, and so you can start dating those traditions and that material influx coming into the Islamic world. So within that narrative framework, you have basically these stories of what I would call tours, let's say tours of paradise and tours of hell. And it's those stories that get passed down and are known much better or more familiar because they're more accessible. What the stories do is they derive all the traditions from the Quran and the Hadith, but they put them together in a much more accessible, contained way. And as a result, I think people don't necessarily go back to the earlier material to see that there is, in fact, ambiguity, and there is a greater element of spirituality in that earlier material than shows up in the later manuals.
So in the later manuals, the sensual character of heaven is emphasized.
Yes.
More so than in...
Yes. And I think it's also very interesting that when you look at the Quranic verses and in some of the Hadith collections, you have a paradise that is very socially driven. It is about, there's an emphasis on tents or pavilion palaces, and about who you'll be meeting and the different children and spouses. The closer you get to the 1200s, by that time with those manuals, it is just the individual believer. And so you can also see this kind of almost pulling the social reality out in a more individualized reward for a believer.
So in the Quran, for example, I mean, among the many verses, among the many surahs that look at, that describe heaven and hell in some detail, the two that come to mind are Surah Rahman, right, which has a very detailed, discussion, and also Al-Waqi'ah, which is Surah number 56. There's a verse here that I'm going to read, that one of the characteristics of heaven is this verse, that in the people in heaven will, it's la yasma'una fiha laghwan wa la ta'sima illa qilan salaman salama. So the people there will hear neither ill speech nor a commission of sin, but only the saying peace, peace will, only a sense of peace will reign in the so this sense of kind of calm, serene stasis, right?
Yes.
Whereas in some sense, in the later accounts, you have a greater emphasis placed on the enjoyment of the sensual character of the materiality of the
Yes.
of the heaven. Huh?
Yes.
Okay. What about in the book? You also discuss some interesting, let's say, theological conundrums. Okay. So in other words, if one of the points of your book is that heaven is something like the idealized aspects of earthly existence, okay, then what happens to the social unit, which might include the family, which might include children, right? So if any desire can be fulfilled in heaven, then what about the desire to have children, for example, right? So does that make, how does that kind of figure in the theological debates about having children if you make it to heaven?
Well, I mean, this is the fun of reading the literature, and particularly Quranic commentaries. The questions that we bring to the material are not the questions that drove the commentators. And it's precisely this kind of reconciling the possibility of a perfected realm where you could have basically anything of your desire. And I think it's very interesting in that desire that you have, for example, intoxicating drink that does not intoxicate, right? That you have the capacity of something that is enjoying that you should not enjoy in the earthly world, but you have a transformed, purified version of it, and you can truly enjoy it in the afterworld. So I think there's a lot of teasing out of what that is, but as you bring up with the example of children, the commentators really struggle with these questions because it is a transformed realm, and so they find clever ways of saying that because you appreciate so much of the perfection, you won't actually want the things that you could have because you're so dazzled by the perfect nature of the garden itself.
That you're already perfected by being in heaven, so you don't need an additional. So the question of desire is.
Yes,
right?
You don't have jealousy. You
Right,
don't have
right,
want.
right.
You don't
Okay.
that all of those negative feelings of comparison, of tthinking, I have two sons. I always want a daughter. I always wanted a daughter. All of those feelings would go away, right?
Yeah. Okay, shall we look at some images? Because now we want to look at, as the centuries progress, as we discussed, what happens with this imagery is that it begins to proliferate also in architecture and painting, in gardens, and etc. Architecture is even earlier, as you mentioned in your book, which is the Umayyad Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And perhaps we can begin to look at some images of architecture and talk about those.
Yes. I'm trained as a historian, so I like to line them up chronologically. And
Sure,
I realized
sure.
we didn't do that. So,
Okay.
so we'll play a little bit. But
Okay.
the first image is one that I think gets to the question of what is a garden. Not what is the garden that we're discussing, but what is a garden. And the garden is fundamentally an enclosed space. You cannot have a garden in nature. So that previous image of the rose, a flower is not a garden. Right? A garden has to be designed. And because of that, a garden is inherently an urban space. So here is an image from a fairly mundane garden in one of the homes from Andalusia, Ronda, Spain. And I just include it because it is not actually famous. It's just, I think, a very kind of lovely garden, and it shows you the interplay that you have between vegetation, the water, the channel, the pavilion structure, and the archway. But when we look at it also historically, there are some examples that I think are notable. One is the gardens of Alhambra in Spain, once again in Andalusia, which gets developed as a complex from 800s onwards up until the 13th century and a little bit beyond. And here is an image from the Generalife, and it shows once again some of the classic elements of what is now constituted or understood as an Islamic garden, which is such a tricky term. But you have this channel of water, you have a pavilion at one end of it, and I think it's worth just mentioning that these are gardens to, like the traditions of the garden, they are visual spectacles. They're not gardens to necessarily picnic in. They're not gardens necessarily that you walk through, but that there are certain vantage points for that garden. Here is another image from a certain section that is close to the Court of the Lions. And then I switch then just to do a big jump to give you a similarity of a garden from Iran called Hasht Behesht in Isfahan. And you have the same image of the pavilion structure with the pool of water, a different set of trees. Here's another one that you get a sense of people and how they stroll along. What's significant about the Hasht Behesht is Hasht 8, Behesht Paradise. So it is named for its structure, which are supposed to give us a sense of the 8 different levels of heaven. So I mentioned 7, but sometimes people top it off and make it 8. And so you have within the pavilion complex, then it's not just the pavilion, the interplay of the water and the vantage point of the viewer, but it's particularly designed to be a reflection of paradise on earth. And you can see that from another architectural rendition as well. And here, even the dome structure is trying to create this kind of crenellation of an idea of a cosmos. So I share those images just to suggest that gardens have a cosmic dimension to them, that they're not just about plants, that they are designed in a particular way, and that these are excellent examples, as is, I just included that to give you a sense that this interplay of garden and pavilion has a very long literature in Persian poetry. So this is a manuscript. There are many exquisite ones. I like to choose the ones that no one looks at because I think it's interesting to see how deep the tradition is. This is the story from Nizami's Haf-Pekar from the late 12th century, and it is a story of 7 pavilions of which there are 7 princesses. Each pavilion has a different color. Each princess is from a different clime, region, and each one is a tale of unfulfilled love till the end of the frame story where there is, of course, fulfillment. So this is the story of the black pavilion, and perhaps it's hard to discern, but you have this interplay of the garden and the pavilion structure. So there is a larger literature about it as well. And of course, we have to consider the Shalimar Gardens, Lahore, which is part of this much larger tradition of thinking about how to architecturally reflect the cosmos in a designed urban space.
Great. So we brought in the relation between kind of architecture and gardens, that gardens are not simply nature. First of all, they are cultivated nature, right? Enclosed and cultivated nature, and then it's also placed in an ensemble which has either a pavilion or some kind of an architectural, a relationship of architecture to the garden, right? Yes. So these are kind of important to think about when we think about Islamic gardens. And continuing this, in some sense, reflecting on the concept of paradise, and but then realizing it in a way that kind of transhistorically, and also quite in quite different places, from Spain all the way to kind of in Persia and the Mughals. This proliferates, of course, and the relation between cosmology and painting and also architecture. So shall we look at some paintings?
Yes. Where are we going next?
Okay. Yeah. So these are earlier, right? So this
yes,
is
these are earlier from the
Yeah.
Umayyad Mosque, and so this is a little bit different, but it just shows you also the reflection of the garden imagery coming from, inspired by Byzantine imagery, but basically from the 700s and 800s. So that is once again a pavilion with flowing water. And so let's go to, shall we go to?
So we can talk about the question of cosmology, right?
All
So
right.
in other words, if you have a picture of heaven or hell, right, and you have these kind of 7 levels, and you have various kind of, let's say, elements, and you need to map that, right? So the kind of the question for the visual artist is how to actually make that happen, right? So, and you see certain schemas for which attempt to do that.
Yes, so
Yeah.
here is a cosmological map. It's a wonderful word. In the middle of it, you'll see the scales of justice, so the deeds being weighed one way or another, and then the possibilities of a paradise which has this kind of vine-like motif towards the top of it with a kind of adjudication of deeds. So this is a map of the Last Judgment and the possible kind of like choose your own adventure, right, where you're going to end up. And here is another one that reinforces that idea of the multiple levels of cosmology, so that by the time you get to those manuals in the 1200s, certain levels of heaven are more resplendent than other levels. And this is just to reinforce this question of cosmology that is through not just the traditions in the Quran and the Hadith, but also through marvels of creation, of picking up the kind of spectacular creations of which we all are, by the time of the Last Judgment, experience on our own.
And Qazvini is, of course, in this book is a very important book about a discussion of marvels. And it's a very central text for thinking about aesthetics in Islamic culture. But you had more.
I had more.
Yeah.
And it's a very strange book.
Okay, yes.
It's a very strange book.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, so this is, as we started our conversation, we realized that there were some images that we both brought to the conversation that actually had a conversation with each other. This is one that I talk about in the book by Sur Gujarati, and it's Mani. This is the heretic Mani, who's painting a dead dog. And in the image, he is painting this image of a dog who is dying, and there are worms oozing out of his body on this kind of pool of water. And it's taken in, once again, this kind of wild, almost wild context, but also garden-like context. And the reason that there's a garden is you have that pavilion structure towards the top. What I think that's so interesting about this image is that it is the painter's painting in my viewpoint. It's about the painter asking very deep questions about perception. How do we know what we know? If we're told that we should live a certain life so that we could gain an altered version of that life in the next world, then how is it that we can perceive what is right and wrong? How do we know and appreciate ourselves within this space? And I think what this painting is suggesting is that there is artifice, and that there needs to be a special kind of cosmic knowledge to be able to appreciate what is decay and what is growth. And so as we were discussing this imagery, Iftikhar brought this painting in.
And this is Imran Qureshi's, painting that was shown in New York at his Metropolitan Museum, commission in 2000 and, a few years ago. And in some ways, you get the sense of, and of course, this is Imran, working out his characteristic imagery of blood, etc. But also painting flowers, floral foliate forms, and leaves in blood. But what's I think important in the discussion of Narina's work is the question of enclosure and the garden as a kind of a bounded and cultivated space, but in this case now the problem that is happening within the garden. Okay, so And we think about the imagery of paradise, as transformed into a trope of the cultivated, bounded garden, which now is, is corrupted at some level, right?
And what I appreciate so much about this image, the other one as well, but this one I think is very striking, especially when you both put both together, is it reinforces your earlier observation that you cannot understand the full nature of the garden if you do not have hell lurking nearby. You cannot understand the kind of the glories of artistic creation if you are not contending with the natural form of decay that is always there, which allows you to appreciate the full form.
And but you also had the Uyghur manuscript. Oh yeah, what happened to the Uyghur manuscript?
What happened to the Uyghur manuscript?
There.
I put this up because Iftikhar really wanted to talk about the tree of Zaqqum, which is back to, so the tree of Zaqqum is
back to hell, okay.
Yes, and it just shows the once again, the nature of the binary is that you have, so you may see people who are being tortured by demons on the left-hand side, but if you look carefully at the form, they're actually hanging from this tree, which is this dreaded tree of hell, and it has a counterpart in heaven. So once again, it's about developing that landscape in a cosmic sense. I wanted to bring this up just as a point of advocacy. Yes. So this is the Palm Complex in Dubai. Some of you may know it. It is a kind of built space that, I would argue is one form of trying to recreate a garden, but literally within the sea. But that it does not necessarily have the same kind of cosmic significance to it. And I believe it had sewage problems as well. Yes, it wasn't
so
designed well.
I believe a much better example is the song and dance sequence in cinema, okay? Which is, because in the song and dance sequence, what happens? You have a narrative unfolding, and suddenly you are in Kashmir, okay? Or suddenly you are in Switzerland, right? And you have multiple changes of clothing, and you have this idealized love. And after the song and dance ends, you are back in your reality, right?
Which is wonderful, because you get to experience cosmic perfection within this earthly life. You don't have to die to get there. Yes.
Yeah, so the song, I was thinking of the 7 levels of heaven and hell,
Yes.
right? And there's a song in Dil Se, right? Which is a film with the Shah Rukh Khan, which is the Satrangi Re, right? And that's the 7 colors, right? And in the song there is a transformation of landscape, 7 different landscape, 7 different changes in costume, and a kind of a Sufi lament throughout, in the song. It's well worth watching in light of this discussion.
Do we have a clip of it?
We don't have a clip of that, although,
Can you reenact it?
Well, I think, do we want to have any audience left? Okay. Well, I do have a song by Noor Jahan, so we can play that maybe. Okay. Can we have that in the Shalimar Garden? I thought, I should maintain fidelity with Lahore.
Yes.
So, can we play just a few minutes of the video, and then we can open it up for questions and answers.
Okay.
Hello, who's taking care of? Is there anyone? All right. All right, I think let's begin with questions and answers, and if we have time, we will, we'll play that Noor Jahan song set in the Shalimar Gardens. So the floor is open for questions. Yes, thank you. Please announce. Wait for the microphone, and please let us know who you are.
As I was listening to you, I was wondering about 2 things. My name is Nina, and one of this is that there is a difference between knowledge that comes from belief and one that comes from knowing.
I'm sorry, what's the knowledge from belief and knowledge from?
Knowing, which is direct experience. And I wanted some understanding of how the latter actually informs your work. because belief to me is a conceptualization of something that gets passed on without questioning.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that came to me, because my background is psychology and religion, is that the 7 is a metaphor. It's an archetype,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's an archetype of actually the unconscious that resides in me and you. So this exploration to me is an exploration of the outward journey, which is the manifestation of appearances in the world. But then there's the unconscious that we all live with that is pretty much unknown to us. And to me, this was symbolic of that inner mind, which we're all actually trying to explore and make conscious. And I wanted to have an understanding from you of how much of both these aspects informed your work. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to take the second about the numbers first because it's easier to address, but it's also so fascinating. Numbers are magical, right? And numbers are symbolic, and particularly in the Islamic texts, numbers each have a significance, even in historical texts, not theological or Sufi texts. So 7 has this dimension of this kind of it is a sanctified number. It is not a neutral number. And I think that's why when I started looking at hadith, that's why if you do something, you get a 70 times more chance of going to paradise, because that 0 is an indication of some sort of infinite capacity. So when you see numbers that are 70 or 70,000, what they're doing is they're talking about the infinite capacity, the infinite multitude of something. When you see the number 72 or 73, that is particularly related to how manuals of heresy started comparing Islam to Christianity, and they had 70 as an infinite number, and then they started adding up as a way of positioning Islam as a doctrine as more significant than Christianity. So I think all of these numbers are important. 2 is about a completion. 4 is about a perfection. So when Prophet Muhammad is said to receive his revelation at 40, was he actually 40? What's important is what that number 40 means. So I think it's really interesting to look at that code of numbers. And for me, the most poignant moment in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, which many people know as this kind of great text of the medieval Islamic world, is in the early parts he looks at the histories and he says, this one, he was saying there's 40,000 here and 70,000 here, and he starts using all these numbers, and he says all of these are not historically correct. There's no way there could have been that many troops on the battlefield. And I look at that point, at that century, and think, that's exactly when we can date that this loss of significance of the number as meaning something more than the actual quantified ability. For your first question, it's a very beautiful question. And I may disappoint you. I really come to this work as a professional historian. I count myself as, this work is very much part of my strong commitment to cultural history. And so when I was talking about looking through text and seeing the kind of invisible threads that bring people together, bring societies together, that shape the way that we live our daily lives, in such palpable ways that we're not even able to recognize them. As a historian, that's what I look for, and particularly my interest in material culture allows me to ask that question about the invisible tenant and tie it to, the flower or the table. So I really don't bring a belief system to it, other than aesthetics are not just about pretty things. Aesthetics are inherently political, and they structure our worlds, and they give us meaning in our lives. And I think if there's a belief system, that would be it that's guiding me.
Yeah, there's a question there. We have very limited time, so please keep your questions very focused.
Hi,
Yeah.
my name is Bahar Behbahani, and thank you so much for this very insightful panels, and I can't wait to get the book and just really immerse myself and learn more. Very quickly, and following your comment actually is just set the note of my question that about like the real life and political aspect of it and the garden. I'm wondering that if you can elaborate a little bit on, because both gardens that you showed, Hashd Behesht and Shalimar, both are royal gardens. And how do you see like this role of, because gardens are not only royal gardens, but we see like all the rulers and they are the patron of like these heavenly paradise gardens. And I really want to know that what's your take on that power structure in the...
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a wonderful question. You're right that the examples that I brought forth are these kind of they're the most elite examples that you can have of a garden, and it's a loss not to be able to have the other varieties in history, and I think that's why I try to bring in these images of that people don't know, that people don't travel about, that are not written about, to show that this interplay or this human desire to create a space that is a garden does not necessarily have to come from a courtly culture. Having said that, I want to say the importance of the courtly garden is, of course, it is, from my perspective, the most magnificent monument. You know, if you build a structure of stone, it should last for a good amount of time. But if you design a garden, someone has to weed it. Someone has to cultivate it. Someone has to replant it. It is constantly in motion. And I think that's, as a historian, what's so fascinating to me is how something that shows the human compulsion of a desire to be in a particular kind of space takes constant work, and it's constantly changing. So the gardens that I showed you, we know that Alhambra did not look like that when it was first designed. There's no way it could, because the trees that are planted right now are fairly modern varieties. This is the same case that has been demonstrated with the Taj Mahal, and I know the same case in the Shalimar Gardens as well. So what we're seeing are these constant reflections of our contemporary imaginings about the past. And that's what makes the garden, from my perspective, the ultimate courtly monument, because it does not last. It does not stand. And yet it has such amount of significance for the way that people live their lives and see value in their lives.
So we have time for just one last question. Okay, there was a question. Yeah. Microphone and.
Judging from your Quetta connection, I suppose.
Please say your name and.
Khalid Ahmed.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned your connection with Quetta, maybe you're also connected with some Western knowledge. Now, there are 8 paradises, and they say Firdaus is the highest. Do you believe that there is a gradation, that the others are lesser, and Firdaus clearly is a Greek word, like many Greek words in the Quran. Have you researched that? And also, how do you explain the pleasures meant for men and women in paradise? Are women more superior because they are given aesthetic pleasure in contrast to men who are into carnal pleasure?
You know, it's a wonderful question, and I have not asked it of myself because I don't think it yields so much. You know, one of the things that's fascinating is in these texts, and I'll stay with the eschatological manuals for the first part, is that they want to have it both ways. They want to give the different levels and to show that Firdaus is the highest, but at the same time to show that all levels are equally resplendent. So there is a clear, there's a cosmic diplomacy that is going on there. And so that's why I think that you do not see in the text the kind of gradations like, oh, I'm just got level 1 and you got level 3. There's none of that, because all of it is so sublime. I think that's the perfect word. And also all of it is so ineffable, the inability to find language to articulate it, which is partly why we need the material culture, right? So it's like you can't exactly know what it's like to be in a cosmic realm of perfection, but you know what a brocade is. So just keep on imagining how superior it is. And I must say, it's a lot of fun to do the history of a time and place that has not happened. So there's a lot of twist in that kind of methodology. The second question about gender is an important one. And it comes up actually in the commentaries as well. So that there are two ways to look at it. One of the things that I do in the book is I look at some of the sumptuary objects, and I note at a certain point that the prophet is given a silk cloak, and he refuses it because that is not the fabric of God-fearing men. He sees that as the fabric of Zoroastrians, of Iranians, and of women. And he gives it then to a female relative. It gets kind of passed through the different khalifas, actually, and the women. And so I think in that section of the book really fascinates me because it suggests that there is a different, not reward, but different permissibility for men and a permissibility for women, that women are allowed the capacity for adornment in the way that men are not enjoined. Now, the texts do not take it as far as to say then one is better than the other, but that there is an aesthetic capacity that is afforded to women and less so for men. Your second part of the question about the carnal nature, I think this also comes up in the text, and are you asking about the Huris? Yes. All right. So this does come in the text. So this refers to the promise of the Quran mentions them explicitly 4 times. There are 8 other times there may be explicit mention, and aside from that, 3 other times that there is reference to pure companionship, but it's not necessarily tied to the word hur or in. And so in the Quran, there is this kind of ambiguous promise of companionship. And the commentators take that promise, and what they do with it is they interpret that as being a female companion. When you look at the Quranic verses, what's interesting about them is that but the companions are often referred to as being pure as pearl. And I think that's one of the capacities that gets lost in the later eschatological manuals, is that there is a spiritual purity throughout the garden, and particularly in these companions as well. So that I would dispute the word carnality. I think that misunderstands exactly what the nature of that reward is. That it has a physical dimension to it because of companionship. There is actually no carnal part in the Quran. But at the same time, it has a spiritual dimension. So it's fusing the two very fluidly. In the commentaries, some of the first commentaries we see that come in the 800s. So first of all, the Quranic commentators, they're very puzzled about the Huri'in, but their questions, as I said, are different than our questions. Their questions are, what in the world does it mean? And they get stuck on things like their skin color is the color of an eggshell. And I cannot tell you how many years I've sort of wondered about eggshells. I go to farm markets, I see a different color, I think, is that this is brown, this is yellow, this is white. So I mean, they get stuck on other types of aesthetic points. But within the commentaries, we do have instances where women actually go and they ask, if my, let me put it, the women, there are 2 particular instances. In one, a woman goes and asks, if I am promised the afterlife with my husband, but he's passed away, and I remarry, with whom do I end up in eternal life? This is a big problem. And then there is another version of that, which is also a woman asking particularly about her placement in relationship to her husband. Maybe he wasn't so good. Right? So this is what shows up even in the 800s. So I think that there is, at that time, we can take that evidence to suggest that there is this questioning on the behalf of, we take two of these anecdotes of women and men seeing themselves as having a different kind of capacity, but at no point in the sources is the interpretation framed the way that you have framed it, which I would suggest is a very modern way of looking at it. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Naveen.
And thank you so much for Iftikhar, who jumped in at the last minute and pulled this all together. So thank you very much.